One very colourful example of this idea of using the Gaijin card is one of the contributors, Elmar Bob, who's from Germany. And he was running a company that was importing a large brand that brings in big medical equipment for hospitals. It was just after the Tohoku earthquake. And their equipment was damaged in several hospitals up in Tohoku. He needed to get replacement machines up there quickly. The problem was that it was going to take too long to get the machines in from Germany, where they were approved to import from. But he also knew, and his staff knew, that there were machines sitting in China and could be in Tohoku within days. But the customs people wouldn't let them import from China because the paperwork didn't say that they were going to import from China. So what he did, there's a bit more to it, but the long and the short of it was we went down, asked again politely, and the customs officer refused. He pulled out his camera and he took the person's photograph. And he said, "Why, you can't take a photograph in here, you can't take my photograph." And he said, "Well, I just want to take the photograph of the face of the person who is going to let children die in Tohoku." And within 30 minutes, they had approval to bring the machines in.
I'm very happy to welcome Frank Foley today, and I'm sure that you know him already because he's a long-term Japan hand, and he has quite a few positions in his career, positions as country manager for different companies here. So it has been a while since he came to Japan, but the thing is that today we're going to talk about his new book, which is titled Stories from the Genba. So this is a book that tells the stories of different country managers here in Japan, and I believe that there is a lot to learn from the book. So Frank, let's start straight away, and so could you please tell us how you came up with the idea of the book and how you actually went about putting it together?
Right. Thanks very much, Maya, and thanks everyone else joining. I see a lot of friends in the room there. Thanks to everyone there too. So the why came up about it was early times in COVID, and listening to be honest, clubhouse rooms like yours, podcasts seem to grow exponentially. As we were all forced to stay at home, so I was naturally a podcast and sort of YouTube and then Clubhouse when it came along, follower anyway, because I really enjoy that sort of programming, all sorts of programming there. So I started to follow it, and in following it, I realized how, I've been in Japan for over 30 years, and there were so many interesting people that I hadn't met. So, through social media, thanks to COVID, if there's a thanks that COVID can have, but it was a small silver lining for me to meet all of these people. The other thing was, as with everyone else, Japan wasn't as strict as draconian as many other countries, but we were forced to stay at home for a long time, and saving money, especially I live in, it's not money, saving time. I live in Kamakura, so I was used to traveling, up to 3 hours a day. So I had all this extra time on my hands as well that I could start to think about maybe doing something that incorporated all of the ideas and these great people that I was starting to meet virtually. And I also, and the other thing I should add, I suppose, is age-wise, I just turned 60. I was about to turn 60 at the start of COVID, and I was starting to look back at what I'd done myself and thinking, well, there's some interesting things that I could probably talk about as well. So that was sort of the background, and then I've always I studied. I was at university in the early 80s and studying. There was a time when Japan was just emerging. Japan is number one, and all of this Nihonjin run stuff going on, and Japan being presented, for the most part in a very ways that emphasized the uniqueness and the specialness and the very very sort of very difficult to understand for foreigners, an exclusive type of culture. And I really, over the years, really didn't believe in that sort of thing from the start. When I first came to Japan as an exchange student and realized, wow, Japanese people are just like us. They get up in the morning, they go to school, they go to work, they have the same sorts of goals, they have the same challenges as we do. So for me, Japan was, sure, as with all cultures, there were differences, but Japan for me was something that was a place that was very familiar and very easy to live in many ways, and I would say easier than many Western cultures for me as as a Western European to live in. So I wanted to look at those stereotypes and really look at, people. I mean, these stereotypes tend to be very descriptive. People would see some simple behavior and then jump to a conclusion about a stereotype and say, oh, well, all Japanese are like this. So, run a very sort of simplistic analysis through it. And I thought, well, there must be better reasons. Yes, some of this behavior is true. We're all seeing it, but the real question is why. And so we wanted to look at those why questions as well. I also wanted to look at, as a country manager over the last 30 years, in addition to the great parts about the job and the amazing opportunities that you do get in Japan, I saw there are also risks that are, I think, unique to remote markets like Japan when you're far away from head office. There are risks for the people doing their job. And I had some issues, some concerns there myself that I'd experienced firsthand, and I wanted to get other people's ideas on those and maybe come up with some ideas to help alleviate those sorts of problems for country managers going forward. When I was thinking about, okay, how do we do this? How do we go about it? To be honest, Tim, and I'd like Tim to pipe in as much as you can here. I really, when I started listening to you talking and the discussions that we got involved in, just the whole idea of stories is just so powerful. I mean, you put me onto a book which was out of print, but I found secondhand eventually on the power of storytelling, and I think people are very interested in hearing about that from you as well. But we immediately decided to go at it from the point of stories, to go out and talk to people who had done this sort of stuff for a long time. And over time and through real life experience had figured stuff out. These people tended to be, they have a foot in both camps, I suppose, that ties us all together. And it's this, an ability to navigate through the challenges, the cross-cultural challenges. What I didn't want to get involved in was people with opinions. And I'm not dismissing opinions, and some opinions are very well informed. But there are lots of academic works out there which we reviewed and incorporated in the book as well. Some of it, and there are a lot of great journalists writing about this sort of thing as well. But we wanted the focus of the book to be the stories, and it's all in the title. So the stories of people doing this from firsthand. So the stories from the Genba. We wanted it to be a chat between peers. So I was really chatting with people rather than interviewing them about their background and from a perspective of having done similar things myself to what they had done. So that's the conversations, and then conversations with Japan Insider. We wanted people with experience, with a lot of experience in Japan, and most of them were involved in Japan from the outset. They'd studied Japanese at school, or they had something that brought them to Japan. So Japan Insiders. And then we wanted to talk to, for this book, we wanted to talk to leaders and managers. So we focused on the country managers. So we went out, and there's nothing scientific about choosing the people. It was large. I started from my own network and went out from there and got some great introductions to new people. So we attempted to get a sprinkling of people across different industries, but it was really just getting out and talking to people that I was comfortable with, knew before, or had some strong introductions, because I was asking people to give up, very busy people, to give up a chunk of time, not only for the initial interview, but we also, as part of the process, went back to them with their edited manuscripts and made sure that they were happy with that story as well. So we were asking for some of their time, so they just really, I felt more comfortable going to people that I knew or had very solid introductions to. We structured the book around two parts. The first part, and it's about a third of the book, is an overview, and it's getting into this question of sort of just trying to set up a mindset of questioning stereotypes and really trying to get to the question of why, and no matter what you're doing. If you're a country manager starting off, or you're experienced and you're seeing this repetitive behavior that you're trying to get around, try and give some. We didn't want, it's a simple business book. We're not academics. But we thought, just based on experience, give people some tools to try and figure out, get beyond the stereotypes and figure out what the real questions they should be asking and get to real solutions. That's a third of the book, and the other 2/3 is the actual interviews. So we've got the discussions I had with each of the contributors. I've just started introducing. We've been releasing little bits of the book on LinkedIn and less frequently on Facebook, but I'll do that as well. But just yesterday, we've started to just put brief introductions of the contributors and a little word on sort of why we selected them and what we wanted to talk to them about. So watch out for that. Have a look at that if you have time. So then part one, the questioning the stereotypes. And I want to spend a lot of time on all of this because, to be honest, what I'd like to move through is really to go over this overview of the book and maybe talk about a bit about what I learned about book writing as well, if anyone else is thinking about writing a book, or maybe people could ask questions along that lines, but to open it up for questions as much as we can. So the types of stereotypes are the ones we come across all the time. Why are Japanese people so group oriented, and why are they so risk averse? As people love talking about risk, why are they so disengaged at work? Why aren't they engaged? And those sorts of questions. But when you look at it, and what we tried to do in a fairly simple way in the first third of the book was to try and lay out some aspects of Japan that when you think of it in that context, these things start to make sense. This observed behavior starts to make sense. So, for example, on the group oriented bit, and it applies to other observations as well, is the whole social contract in Japan is so important. It just impacts so many parts of life and so many decisions that people make. And the guts of it, as we all know, is that basically people accept discipline in return for security. So people will obey rules or be part of a group, be what's called group-oriented, not because of some innate Nihon Jinron type stuff, but it's out of self-preservation. It's fear of being excluded, and this comes in a country, as we all know, that can face a natural disaster at any time. I mean, Tim, down in Atami there, you had a horrible landslide there just within the last 2 years. So people have to come together in those sorts of situations. They all, we read a lot, and people talked as part of this book as well. People talked about, the rice culture idea is real. It is a fact that in small communities, in a very short space of time, people had to complete a very labor-intensive task, and that meant that everyone had to do their bit. And the way to make sure that no one misbehaved and didn't do their bit was that the implication of not doing your bit was to be excluded, and nobody wants to be excluded. So when you look at it's no surprise then that Japan is, when you look at this, the sociologists talk about loose cultures and tight cultures and all the attributes of all of those. It's no surprise that Japan is at the tight culture end of the spectrum. So the real question then is not why are Japan group oriented or why they're not engaged. It's more questions like, so why do they? Why are they so observant? And then you start to realize that, wow, there is this context. So then a manager in a company, a country manager, or even in your own life, you can start to look at the processes, the tactics, to be able to get people engaged, or whatever you're trying to achieve at that time, to get people to accept the risk of some form of change management. You can come up with ways that work in the Japanese context, and there's just endless numbers of examples throughout the book on that. I had just to throw in a sort of a personal example. We had this case ourselves in our area here with the Chonaikai, where how in Japan the actual zoning laws are very loose in many cases. They're not strict at all. But what holds everything together is the laws that are made up within the Chonaikai, and we have very strict rules here in our charter that says that specifies the distance between houses and what could the approval that you have to get from the Chonaikai to paint your house an unusual color or build it over a certain height or whatever. We had a case a little while ago where somebody tried to build an Airbnb, and I have never seen a community come together in a scarier way, far scarier than any police or any lawyers, to prohibit this from happening. So you see this working all the time. So the first part of the book sort of looks at a lot of that sort of thing and just gives some hints. There's a lot more there as well, but I don't want to get too tied up on it this morning. And we've pulled some of the examples. There's some examples that we pulled from some academic work, like Ulrike's book that she's been on here talking, and some other observers of Japan. and also some of my stories and stories from that we pulled forward from the interviews into the first part of the book as well. And then you get to the even more interesting part of the book, and that's part two, and that's where there are 13 complete interviews in the second part of the book. And I suppose there were some just themes that come through. There's honestly, a friend mentioned to me the other day, they said, no matter what page you open on this book, you just come across something that maybe you could write another book on, because the stories, not because of anything that myself and my co-author David have done, but because the stories are so interesting. But the themes that come through very strongly, the first one is, and it's no surprise, but there are sort of shades to it, is that culture and the understanding culture is very, very important. This, I mentioned the idea of the importance of having a foot in both camps. As one, Alan Malcolm is from the corporate training, publishing, and professional training world, and he works with big companies like Nikkei. And he said, he's constantly found through his career that partners, Japanese partners, they don't want a representative of head office. They want someone, and they're assuming that you are someone with a holistic 360 perspective, and that's what they want there. They don't want a representative from head office. They want someone who gets Japan and gets what they're trying to do as well. The other, more like communication type things that come through is, they're just the different styles of communication. There's an example from Rochelle Kopp has a story that she allowed us to use in the first part of the book about when she was helping on some high-level negotiations on a military defense deal between Japan and the US. And she says in her written piece on her blog that, at one stage there's so much miscommunication on the US side that they started to think that the Japanese side were lying to them. And it wasn't the case at all. It was just that there was no one in the room, and that's what she came in and was able to do later on to get things back on track. Tim, I've written down here Tim's story of different concepts of the purpose of a meeting, which you gave us that little story for the first part of the book as well. Do you want to jump in and tell that story now, or?
Yeah. It was a video conference, and it was a Japanese company in the U.S. They were working on a new model design, and it was a component, I believe. And so they're at this meeting, and the Japanese, one of the engineers in Japan, a manager, presented information about a test, and that test had proven since then invalid. And the American side of, it was a Japanese company, but the American side had the more updated, correct information. And the guy, the American engineer involved, knew this, and he told me this story. He said, on the one hand, I wanted to just shout out, hey, no, we have new data. But he goes, I just felt like, I guess he read the room, and he so he said, I turned to my Japanese boss sitting next to me, and I whispered to him that was outdated, that I had up-to-date, accurate information, and should I say something? And he said, no, let's do it offline. No need to do it here. And the reason he told me this story was because I was talking about the concept of, not ensuring somebody doesn't lose face. And by the way, that was posted on LinkedIn the other day. If it's your superior, you don't want them to lose face. If it's your subordinate, they're kind of loosey-goosey with the face stuff, right? But that's a diversion. So I was just basically saying the purpose of the meeting is usually to announce a decision that's already made. It depends on which kind of meeting you're involved in, of course. But this was more like an information exchange meeting. So anyway, all of it was done offline, and he realized they're trying to maintain at least surface harmony within the meeting, while the Americans default to what's the truth. And not only Americans, Westerners, just in general. And so it was truth versus harmony. And I'm not saying the Japanese don't like the truth. I'm just saying when truth and harmony collide, sometimes, the truth gets swept under the rug and they work things out behind the scenes, right? So the Americans, we don't realize often that comes, or I should say even Westerners, that comes from the Greek tradition of putting truth at the top of the hierarchy of values, which, from there we eventually created science, and So those are all important. And I'm not saying we always tell the truth. I'm saying in our own hearts and minds, we believe that's the right thing to do, whether we do it or not. So that's the story. Does that?
Yep, absolutely. And it's not sort of sweeping under the rug, isn't it? The end goal is the same. It's just there's a different way of getting there. And the important thing was that Japanese senior manager sitting there who said, no, just stay quiet. This will all be fine. He knew that. And it wasn't even reading the room, I don't think. It was that understanding the process, understanding the purpose of why we're here right now, what we're doing, and when we'll get to it, the equivalent of the Western style truth is going to be a little later on.
It's more confrontational, I guess, is my point. We believe that the dialectic debate gets us to the truth, so that's kind of our unspoken way of operating. While in Japan, those are happening behind the scenes, mostly. Right.
Yeah. So there are those different styles of communication. There are others like one. Stephen Cox, who's been involved in PR and advertising for a long time, was running a French agency, Havas. He shared a story of how when he joined Havas, he found that there were there's just such different assumptions about how people are educated and trained for work. And what had happened in his case was that that Westerners had done the hiring, and they had made the assumption that based on resumes and based on the educational path or the career path, if they headhunted someone from a big Japanese brand company or even an ad agency, was that they had all these skills because that's how people are trained in the US and in European, MBAs, for example. Everybody has these templates that they all learn as part of their MBA if they're going into advertising. And actually, that wasn't the case. So, he used the expression, which I really liked. He said it's almost like asking a fish to describe water or trying to describe air to a fish, because neither, they didn't. The French side in this case, they didn't even understand that they had a problem because they didn't know about this background, about the fact that the people they had hired had come through a completely different education and training process. And the people on the Japanese side didn't know what the head office people were saying because they didn't understand the assumptions that were made about them when they were being hired. So he came in and knowing all of this was able to over a period to fix this. So there are stories around those sorts of things as well. And it's all about this having a foot in both camps, being able to realize everyone knows there's a problem, but figuring out what the problem is does mean understanding both sides of the equation. But others talked about, we all talk about culture and we have to be really sensitive to culture, but also, people gave stories about how you can go too far with this as well. Jeff Daggett, who ran Nike and other major brands, Gap, and was with Disney for a long time. And so Jeff, he said, cultural sensitivity is important, but you must put it in context. And he said, some of the people he was working with at times, they'd almost turn up at Narita wearing kimono. And that's, not what you need either. It's all about a balanced judgment call. And this is something that came up from lots of different people in lots of different industries. One of the contributors, Giles Duke, is from the music business, and music is really, really, really conservative. And he said, what he found over the years is that the real skill is knowing when to push for change and knowing when to accept the Japanese way of doing things. And I think this is, this is true. And one of the other sort of related points that comes up a bit is, sometimes we forget that the reason things are like the way they are in Japan is because Japanese people like it that way, and Japanese people like Japan, and they don't need us foreigners coming in and telling them a different way to do it. It came up. I was listening to Tim Romero's Disrupting Japan, and he had a guest on there who was talking about just that, and he said, we all come in thinking, Japanese, user experience is horrible and the interface is horrible and everything like this. But a lot of this, and this Brandon Hill, I think his name was, Brandon was explaining exactly, why things are the way they are in Japan. And, yes, there are some things that we can come in with Western design sensibility and some better ideas on user experience overall. But, you always have to have in your mind that there are things that are, as Giles said, you just need to know when it is that things are like this because Japanese people actually like it better than this, and when we can offer and push for change. One very colourful example of this idea of and sort of like using the gaijin card is another way of putting it, is one of the contributors, Elmar Bob, who's from Germany, and he was running a company that was importing a large brand that brings in big medical equipment for hospitals. It was just after the Tohoku earthquake, and their equipment was damaged in several hospitals up in Tohoku. He needed to get replacement machines up there quickly. The problem was that it was going to take too long to get the machines in from Germany, where they were approved to import from. But he also knew, and his staff knew, that there were machines sitting in China and could be in Tohoku within days. But the customs people wouldn't let him wouldn't let them import from China because the paperwork didn't say that they were going to import from China. And his team, his Japanese team, went down there and they pleaded and did everything that they could. And they went back to him and they said, look, this is a case where we need you to be a big bad foreigner, get down there. So what he did, there's a bit more to it, but the long and the short of it was we went down, asked again politely. The bloke, the person, the customs officer refused. He pulled out his camera and he took the person's photograph. And he said, "Why you can't take a photograph in here? You can't take my photograph." And he said, "Well, I just want to take the photograph of the face of the person who is going to let children die in Tohoku." And within 30 minutes, they had approval to bring the machines in. That's an extreme case, but it was a judgment call that he made there to, not be so observant of culture. In this case, I've got to be a big bad foreigner and pull the gaijin card. This isn't quite as dramatic, but we had we interviewed a very senior person from the banking industry, and they the digitization of business in Japan, as we all know, has got a boost from COVID, but is still lagging way behind, and nowhere is that more true than in the banking industry, and. This is the reasons for this are the whole approval process, the hanko and having to send documents around for multiple approvals and no one taking responsibility. These are real things, and in his mind, although things improved because of COVID, he says in many ways just culture is holding companies back so much, and in the meantime the rest of the world is moving on. And one of the other contributors was almost screaming at me in the interviewing, saying, "Where have all the entrepreneurs in Japan gone? This is the country that brought us the Walkman and so much in the past." But it's not happening now, and the rest of the world is overtaking them. So, there are, I think, those sorts of areas where foreign country managers can, with the right level of cultural sensitivity, also push in various ways for positive change. So we're just up to a half an hour. Maybe will I stop there? And do you want to open it up for questions, or do you have any questions?
Oh, yes. Thank you very much, Frank. While I was listening to you again, I was just nodding, in front of my computer. And I think that the book is very important because of, what we know, that people who come to Japan, the newcomers, they usually very seldom realize how important it is to be accepting of the local ways of doing things, the Japanese culture, because culture, it penetrates every single aspect of life, every single aspect of business as well. But also, as you said, it is important to accept that, because you can be strategic, but at the same time, the Japanese people like it the way it is, and so we cannot push change upon anyone if they don't want to change. So there are so many things, that come to my mind. But I want to open the room to questions, of course, and comments. So the floor is open. Tim.
Yes. Well, no, I just like Maya said, I can relate to so many things you said. And for example, feeling comfortable in Japan. I know that some people, for whatever reason, they just struggle. And just Japan is not for them. And it's not because they're bad people. It's just their personality, whatever, their outlook, their experiences, and also who you meet when you come here, which is really important because we all meet different people, right? So for me, it was very comfortable. And I think like you, Frank, in my mind, I tended to say, okay, the common points, the most important common points we share. And yeah, on the fringes, there's a lot of differences that affect things. And so that I was coming from oh man, we're a lot alike. We're more alike than I thought we were when I showed up. You know what I mean? When I got here. And so I just wanted to kind of make that point, but I'm really happy for you. I feel like even though I didn't have anything really that much to do with the book, I remember you came to us with the idea. You weren't really pitching it. You were just kind of, I guess we were your sounding board, right? And we talked about it. And so I remember when you first came up with the idea. And so as I wrote on that LinkedIn post, to see it come to fruition, it just makes me really happy and very, proud of you for what you did. So thank you for putting it together. I think we need more books like this that, again, tell those stories, because people relate to it and they remember it. And I think it's more meaningful than just throwing out statistics and platitudes. And as you said, furthering stereotypes, right? Mm-hmm. So just another point, you mentioned rice culture. And it's funny because most of us don't realize how impactful these ancient traditions are on even in our own cultures as well, on modern day, what's happening today even in a factory, and how you can look at the behavior and see that it came from rice culture. And I'll give you a really good example. I read Reischauer's, all of his books, late 70s, early 80s. And if anyone's read Reischauer, it's packed with, it's very dry, but it's very historical. And one comment about rice culture stuck. He said the one natural resource that the Japanese had a lot of is people. So, and they were resource starved and had to be very creative in, putting their rice paddies on sides of mountains, right? Because of the lack of space. And so when you have that setup, you tend to be labor intensive to maximize your yield of the minimal resources that you have, right? And sometimes I've seen that. I've seen extremely labor intensive things to eke more yield out of something. And I think we see that in maybe less emphasis on labor efficiency in Japan than certainly in the West, or as I see it. And I understand Japanese have gotten very efficient in the factories. I was part of that. But most of those efficiencies, the kernel of that started with, Henry Ford, Frederick Taylor, so they took it and they did really well with it within the context of factories, right? So I just, don't underestimate the power of rice culture and how it, helped create this collectivist mentality. And it's not only Japan. Most rice cultures are very collectivist, right? So I thought that was interesting. And then the last point about Ulrike and coining that term tight culture, that's a brilliant coining of the term. And I used to talk about it, but I never used the word tight culture. But what I used to do is superimpose the Japanese bell curve, for example, on customer service to America's. America's was wide and flat. Japan was tight. So even the bell curve reflects that idea of a tight culture visually. So it kind of resonated with me. Mm-hmm. So anyway, that's all I wanted to say. Again, thank you for writing the book. All the points you made were salient, and I think everybody, hopefully in this room, is enjoying it and learning from it. And I will yield the floor.
Okay. And I think it's all about the stories. I suppose what myself and David tried to do is just put the stories in some sort of context. But the stories are what the book is about. And there are listening to your comments there, Tim. In my mind, I'm saying, oh yeah, that's just like such and such said, or this is like this. If there's one story that I'd ask people to maybe jump to first when they pick up the book, is some people might know Harold Kotso is a Canadian lawyer with triple degrees. He's got a degree in computer science and a degree in philosophy, and on top of being a lawyer and totally fluent in Japanese. And the way he describes things is just like, it's beautiful. And I invite anyone to read that. And he talks about this idea of why, so there are the rice culture and the country, facing natural disasters is a background to everything. But the implication of it today is that people are motivated by self-interest, and the self-interest is all about not being excluded, not being kicked out of the circle. So then you start to understand, okay, well, that's why HR sets up its whole sort of career management of people like this. And this is why companies have open plan offices, because more people are motivated by being observed to be doing the right thing, rather than by a big bonus at the end of the year or a fast track to management. There are these reasons that if you have your mind on, you don't have to understand absolutely everything, but if you have an appreciation of that background, then you start to understand why your team behaves in a particular way when faced with some project or some challenge that you've all got. So I really would I recommend this book, not because of anything that David and I wrote, but just to read the stories, the interviews with people, and maybe then reach out to some of these people and hear more from them.
Yeah, that's really a great way to actually communicate with them and hear from them and their insights and thoughts. And while I was listening again to you and Tim also, I think that one of you mentioned that Japan appeals to a certain type of people, and not everybody can actually survive, let's say, survive in quotation marks, of course, but survive here for a long time. So, Frank, I wonder, what is your take on this? So what is that type of person, who can be here, appreciate the country, its culture, and be successful in this place?
I think, one of the other themes that come up that I didn't talk that much about is, the idea of, does a company need an expat from head office, or does a company need a Japan insider? And I suppose the conclusion of this book is that people who already are totally comfortable and are living in Japan because they love living in Japan and choose to live in Japan rather than live anywhere else, are going to be better equipped to take most businesses forward. So the alternative is the expats, and I think in a professional setting, it's more those sorts of people that are the ones who would be talking about Japan is just crazy and I don't understand it, and because they don't get all of that background. I think certainly most people with my sort of background, and a lot of the people in the room here today, this is not a prison. We're here because we love it. So we don't. We'll have our ideas about things. We'll have ideas about how things could be better, and there's no problem in talking about that. But essentially, we're here because we love it. I think this. I find it less of a problem today than I would maybe, when I came here first in the 80s, where it probably was a lot more different because there was no social media, because you were really, really isolated. You had very little interaction with the outside at all, either through media or there were fewer foreigners around and everything. But today, Japan is just such a cosmopolitan, international, but also sort of Japanese place as well. People I hang around with they love it, for the most part.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because when I was here for 10 years originally, 77 to 87, I adapted almost too well. Where I and it was subconscious because I was always around Japanese people, so you take on their mannerisms, and sometimes it's kind of creepy. You almost act too Japanese. And going back to the U.S. for 30 years was good for me to go back and kind of find my personality, my sweet spot, right? And that's kind of to Frank's point. If you overdo the conform to Japanese ways thing, it's also not good, especially if you abandon your authenticity. And I think, finding your sweet spot, like where you're going to adjust and adapt, but also picking your battles. And Jen has made the example of that the medical equipment was a really good example. I mean, that's a good example, a dramatic one of picking your battles, because if you're doing it all the time, it actually becomes counterproductive, and you need to know where that line is and when to push, and to your point, Frank, when not to push. So I guess some of the finding, I'm trying to tie this to Maya's point about like what kind of person is here. I think you have to have a positive mindset, but I also think you have to be open to the experiences and be authentic, be who you are, but learn to adapt in a way that you're happy, you're satisfied. And it's all, in the end, it's about, do you find meaningful, I think, relationships with people here and see their humanity rather than looking at stereotypes.
Yeah, and I think that we often talk about third culture kids. So they are the kids of international marriages, either here or in other parts of the world. But maybe we can also include the expatriates who have been, well, they first came as expatriates but stayed here long term. So as you said, Tim, you adapt to the local culture. At the same time, you still preserve the things that you learned when you were a child back home. So it's an interesting mixture of what happens eventually, the final product. Maybe that's also a third culture adult, or I don't know how to put it. It probably sounds strange, but Frank, go ahead.
I know. I was just thinking as you were talking there. The other side of this sort of expat, and then what we call Japan insider country managers. The other thing that came through in the book was that on the Japanese team side, if a company sends in an expat, and the assumption is that they're going to be for 3 years, maybe 5 years at the longest, it's very easy for the Japanese team then to just sit tight. They're not going to engage in, for example, if change management is a thing that people are trying to do, they're not going to do that because this bloke is going to leave, or this lady's going to leave in 3 to 5 years. They're thinking about their longer term career with the company and what's going to happen to it after that. So they will quietly resist any change. So then that expat country manager is going to feel a lot of frustration because they won't even understand half the time why they're not able to make this change. But the truth is that the Japanese team will often dig in and quietly resist anything which causes frustration for the expat manager, and he or she ends up hating Japan. That's something I think that's a real thing. Otherwise, sort of looking for types of people, my brother lives in Germany, and the stories he tells about Germany are even more extreme than anything I've heard here. I think it's true of any culture. If you go to any different culture, you're going to find certain things that are going to frustrate you and other things that don't. And it's the people who, ultimately see more that they like in a place than they don't like in a place are the ones who stay. And that's the common thread of, any of us. I think pretty much anyone on the in the room today, we've all been here a long time. For whatever reason, and the reasons can be different from person to person, we've found that Japan, on balance, is a better place than anywhere else for us to live.
I just want to jump in before we forget, because David Sharp made a great question, posed a great question. Where can we find and buy your book, Frank?
Amazon. So what we've done is, so the quick question, Amazon, and we've you can buy it on print on demand, which there's just such I hate Amazon sometimes, but I love them other times. Their print on demand system is absolutely amazing because it's exactly the same as holding stock. They'll deliver it to you the next day. So I prefer print copies, so that's what I order myself. You'll have it the next day. It's also available as an ebook, and if you have signed up for Kindle Unlimited, you can get it for free through Kindle Unlimited. And I had written down a note for myself here today that anyone who's joined the call today, I do have a PDF copy, and if people want to share their email, I'd be happy to send the PDF copy to them. I would ask that you don't share it further than yourself, And I'd also appreciate, if you like it, and if you like any of the stories in there, if you can pass the word on. I'd really appreciate it as well. But if anyone wants to drop their email in a message to me on LinkedIn, I'd be happy to send them the PDF copy.
Great. Thank you. And then I can see also we have a comment from Janos here. So Janos talks about the example you made about the medical equipment. So great example. The Japanese under pressure can make fantastic decisions. Yes, indeed.
And you could see that. You could almost imagine the conundrum there for the customs officer. There are rules that he had to follow and everything. And in a way, you could almost think he was grateful for Elmar pulling out his camera, because it gave him an excuse to break the rules. Otherwise, it can be very difficult for people. So, I don't think it's entirely, Japan being inflexible. It's, sometimes it's about giving people the right excuse to break the rules, to do what everyone knows is the right thing to do.
Yes, indeed.
David is on stage. Welcome, David.
Good morning, everybody. Frank, it's good to hear your talk. That was really interesting.
Thanks very much for joining.
Yeah, Frank, just a couple of kind of things you mentioned about digitization that I really struck home with me. I'm looking forward to getting the book and reading specific stories about it, but I can just share a short little story from my own experience. During the pandemic, I was returning from a ship that I'd been stuck on for 8 months, and at the time, the Japanese immigration and visa system had kind of broken down. And using my kind of 10, 15 years experience in Japan, I kind of figured, how am I going to handle this situation? And I was aware I can use the gaijin card, and I can act up a little bit, but also, how are the Japanese officials involved going to be thinking about this? So I ended up, trying to use my Japanese cultural knowledge to say, okay, if I turn up and say, I'm a foreigner, my wife's Japanese, she's, it'd be nice if I could see her, they're probably going to say no. So I flipped it round, and I said, okay, my wife, she was very pregnant at the time, and my father-in-law, he's maybe a little bit ill. So I kind of painted a story in my application saying why it was good for specific Japanese individuals, or for Japan as a society, to allow me to enter their country, even though the country was technically closed to many foreigners at the time. And that seemed to work. And this, it kind of worked because the Western approach to digitization seems to be to remove the human element. Everything's a click box or a piece of computer equipment. Whereas when you come to Japan, and if you look at their more recent AI and digitalization policy stuff, because of this rice culture background we've been talking about, they're always looking to use technology to include the human element. So in the airport in Narita, although it was all digitized and automatic and all done on the computer, there was an individual human being with a hat on sitting in front of me who got to make the decision, do I let this guy come into Japan or not? Whereas if you come to the UK or the US and you face their visa system, it's so automated and digitized that there's no human element anymore. So I thought, which is quite interesting, looking at different cultural approaches to technology, that Japan always seemed to use their technology to emphasize that at some point there will be a human decision maker. So anyway, I just thought I'd mention that because you mentioned the digitization there and the race culture stuff. So
yeah, it's a great example of sort of observed behavior actually displaying the opposite of what people would assume, because people would assume that Japan is more rules based and not bending the rules, where actually what you're saying is that done the right way, the human element allowed for the rules to be broken in a way that wouldn't have happened possibly in the US in the context.
That is so true. And I can give two quick examples. In manufacturing, a lot of my American compatriots would approach a line and say, do we automate this or do we go manual? And it was like a binary decision. The Japanese would look at it from every angle, and in the end, they more often than not, they'd say they were focused on how do we harmonize humans with technology to optimize this process and leave in flexibility. So the human element was always, most of the time, was in that equation. The other one about breaking the rules, when I was a student, when I first came here, I went to Waseda for a year just to study Japanese. So I was on a culture visa. So then after that year, I went to ICU, and now I was a regular student, and I filled out my paperwork. I didn't realize that for me that was a visa upgrade. And for me to upgrade that visa, I was supposed to leave the country. I didn't know this, right? So I go to the Yokohama New Kokukan Nijimusho, and I, had all the documents prepared. I hand it to the lady behind the counter. She reads through it and she looks at me and she basically tells me, "You have to leave the country. I can't approve this." And I almost started crying. I was a student. I didn't have a lot of money. It was, we were in already. The semester had started. I couldn't afford to leave. And she looked at me. She looked left, looked right, and she approved it. She broke the rule because she looked at me and she saw how distraught I was. And if I had done this by paperwork remotely, I absolutely would have been rejected. So I have seen those rules broken. So David, that's just a really, really good observation. Thank you for that.
It is, yeah.
Yes, thank you for that. Bruce, good morning and thank you for joining us. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes, great. We can hear you now too.
Okay. Thanks, Frank, for all you've done and all you're doing. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Bruce.
A bit about me is, I came here 41 years ago. I've lived here 27. Tim, as you said, you've got to have personality. And I like it enough that I like being here a lot, but I also come back and forth. And I live in my current wife's family is extremely local. Going back, and my father-in-law, who's passed away, is, by the way, just checking off a bunch of things that Tim said, rice culture. Yeah, massively. Going with a friend, and I'd overstayed my visa, and this was before 9/11, but I'd overstayed my visa, and I'd gone in, it was in Kanda then, and my friend's going, "You're going to jail." And with like a 30-minute interview, I walked out and the immigration officer slapping me on my back, laughing and like putting his hand inside his pocket and mean, "You're going to make a lot of money." And he just lets jaw drop. He says, "Well, you got to know what to say." That being said, in the Chonaikai happened where one of and my father-in-law was a guy in the neighborhood, and not because he was a businessman, but he's just because of longevity. And I think this is another topic. But within the Chonaikai was looking at a map, and you had talked about the different variations. And I wanted this guy I'd seen around in the Chonaikai. And he looked at me, and he wouldn't answer, and he said, "Gaijin Nikomu." And the woman who was helping me was really shocked. And finally, this get back to my mother-in-law, and in the neighborhood, he kind of rapidly say hello. But the point being, the Japanese who come up to foreigners, they're very foreigner friendly, but also would find that there's probably a certain percentage that, because of things that happened in World War II in this fellow's case, that are pretty anti-foreigner. And the question is, in a very roundabout way, is: have you run across this in work, and do those things get put aside for work? If you're African American in Japan, and you face racism or xenophobia, it's really clear, especially in the South, a lot of the time. But Japanese are polite, but they just won't talk to you. So that's my question, and if you can talk about times that if you run across it at all.
In a business setting, what I've thought myself, and what a lot of people have mentioned as well, is that often this is a sort of an expat experience versus an experienced Japan insider as well. Is that Westerners, we tend to pick the wrong person as the best person to talk to, at work. So someone who is very outspoken, someone who speaks great English, might not always be the best person to talk to, might not always be the smartest person in the room, and in fact, often isn't. So I think, in a work setting, that's what I've seen, is my colleagues visiting from overseas would automatically zero in on the wrong attributes of sort of actually what you need, what was needed in the company, what was needed to do the job. And often the smartest person in the room is the quietest person who's not talking at all, and you've got to work to draw that out of them. I'm not sure if that answers your question, Bruce, but it is something, a very sort of different way of reading people.
Yeah, and this is another thing where I think Japanese have a much better, and this is one of the things I like about it, they'll put away their personal feelings, especially if they're at work. and just they'll be friendly and stuff, but they may not, just may have a bad experience with English as a child, or it can be a bunch of different reasons. And but just was curious, and it's a good answer. Thank you.
In my bubble, I rarely have come across prejudice that I thought was malicious. I have, but it's pretty much the exception for me. I've come across a lot of prejudice based on ignorance. And I've mentioned this before. I always saw my role as kind of being an ambassador, connecting with people and changing how they think, one person at a time. And I've done it over the years. My biggest win was my mother-in-law, who absolutely could not stand me. I was the barbarian, and she didn't want her daughter to marry me. And it took me about 30 years, but I finally won her over, my biggest accomplishment. So now, that said, I understand your point about African Americans, but I know some who have thrived here, and they are outstanding people who also figured out how to build relationships. And does that mean that it's still not an issue? I don't think so. But again, I'm probably not qualified to make that determination. So I think there's a lot in any country, my own included. There's built-in prejudice. It's baked in. To me, the question is, what's the intention? Is it malicious, or is it just ignorance? And ignorance you can deal with. We all can. We can reach out and connect with people and gently and strategically win them over. Or I don't know if that's the answer you were looking for, but
you're exactly on. Actually, when I lived in Australia for a couple of years, and had the same thing as an American, going like, "You're really nice for an American." And I go, "Well, how many Americans have you met?" "None." "What do you know about America?" "Television." So, but yeah, and in this point about to give it credit to Japanese, there isn't really any of that viciousness that you can find in the United States. It's just they won't talk to you, but your point, Frank, was actually really well made. Is that the person in the room that you really may not talk to may not have the best English, and but yeah, that I agree wholeheartedly. And it's I wouldn't be here if I didn't think it was a great place. And the people all of you have come and stayed, hats off. And but there's kind of some part of me that I don't know if anybody knows what See's Candy is. It's a box, and you can pick a bunch of stuff. That's part of my personality, is like going to different places. And so anyway, but yeah, pretty much it's good points, and just interesting if I hear your feedback.
Thank you, Bruce. David, thank you, Frank, for coming. Frank, especially for telling us about the new book and the stories there, for putting it together and publishing it as well. So it was a pleasure having you all today, and we're looking forward to having you here again. So thanks a lot. Have a great day, and we'll see you again.